Good evening. I'm John Grant, International Vice President of the United Food and Commercial Workers and President of Local 770, covering Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, Ventura, San Luis Obispo County. And with me is Kathy Finn, our Secretary Treasurer. With me tonight is Andrea Zinder, International Vice President as well. I'm President of Local 324 in Orange County. And Matt Belt, their Secretary Treasurer, I'm sorry. Faye Gunther and Joe Mizrahi from Local 21 are with us in absentia, but Sean Embry, field director, is here from the great state of Washington and Local 21. Kim Cordova, president of Local 7, international vice president of Colorado and Wyoming, and Kevin Schneider are not with us tonight. And if we could take a moment of solidarity, they are preparing to go out on strike this week, and they won't be with us tonight as they've got some important logistic preparations to make. Similarly with this is Todd Walters, president of Local 135 from San Diego County, and Grant Tom, his secretary treasurer. Joe Duffel, president of 1167 of the Inland Empire, with Matt Bruno, secretary treasurer. Mark Ramos, president of 1428 Los Angeles County, with Deliana Spates, his secretary treasurer. Mike Hines, president of Local 367 for Greater Seattle. And somewhere in the mix is Brian Wynn, international vice president and regional director. Information is really the oxygen by which we're able to fuel our mission. And in this moment, our mission is to negotiate the best contract ever for grocery workers. Over the last 4 years, the leadership of the United Food and Commercial Workers and the locals in Washington, Colorado, and Southern California have met and discussed, how can we get a better contract? What do we need to do to become stronger? And we began a series of endeavors to work together, engage in a variety of collective actions. But tonight's a special one. A few years ago, Local 324 commissioned a white paper or research document on Disneyland, and that information enabled all the unions there to get their best contract ever. But if the information with such a report can be a benefit, to not make it available to those who need it, it becomes a burden. So tonight we'll have a discussion of Hungry at the Table, a white paper on grocery workers at the Kroger Company. With us to lead the discussion tonight are two of this excellent document's authors. Daniel Flaming, president of the Economic Roundtable, whose doctorate in urban studies comes by way of schooling through Pomona College, UCLA, and USC. Peter Dreyer, distinguished professor of politics at Occidental College, graduate of Syracuse University and the University of Chicago, who has his own Wikipedia page. They are responsible for directing, writing, and overseeing the document we will be reviewing tonight. They are two of the smartest, most progressive, and savvy folks one will ever come across. But even more important, they're willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with us in our fight. And without further ado, I'd ask Daniel and Peter to lead us in discussion of this great document that you all put together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and warm introduction, John. It has truly been an honor to work with the United Food and Commercial Workers locals, and it's an honor to be here tonight to share information. Could we start the slides? And so this is the cover of the slide. And could we go to the next slide, please? So we were asked by the United Food and Commercial Workers locals to report back with the hard facts about grocery workers. We were asked to produce a factual, data-based, evidence-based report on the economic conditions, the workplace conditions, and the company profits of Kroger. And my colleague, Peter Dreyer, and I are going to brief you on this information. I truly want to thank everyone who's here tonight to be part of this discussion, and also to thank from the bottom of our hearts the shop stewards and the UFCW staff who did the enormous heavy lifting to get a truly strong, broad-based response to the survey that was carried out. After Peter and I finish going through the slides, the meeting is going to open up for questions, comments, and discussion. So we're eager to hear your thoughts and your feedback when we get to that part of our meeting tonight. Next slide. So we did a survey. I made a mistake on this slide. It was actually 8 Kroger brands that employ about 37,000 workers in the regions that we surveyed. This is Colorado, the Puget Sound region of the state of Washington, Southern California, and the bottom tip of Wyoming. And the 8 brands that we heard back about from workers were Smith's, City Market, Food for Less, Food Co., Fred Meyer, King Soopers, Quality Food Centers, and Ralph's. So all 37,000 workers were invited to respond in an extensive survey. Over 10,000 workers responded. This is a 28% response rate. That is very strong. Workers from every single one of the 401 stores that were surveyed responded. So the result is a survey that is broad-based, that is very deep, and that is very reliable, and that was scientifically conducted. Next slide, please. So one of the things we asked in the survey is how many jobs workers have. And for 86% of Kroger employees, the Kroger job is their only source of income. However, only 35% of workers have full-time jobs. So the economic condition of Kroger workers and the conditions that need to change are the result both of low wages and short hours. Next slide, please. So the average pay of Kroger workers is $29,655 a year. And we measured this against the living wage. The wages that Kroger workers receive are over $16,000 less than a living wage of $45,760. This is based on the counties that these workers live in. It's based on their household structure. And the living wage calculator is produced by a researcher at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and it looks at the cost of basic necessities in each county, things like housing and food, clothing, shoes, transportation. The typical Kroger worker needs a wage of $29.33 an hour, given how many hours of employment they have and the number of people in their household, to have a living wage. This is at least $880 a week. And this graph on the right side of the slide breaks this out a little more. So what's going on in this graph is on the bars that go to the right are showing the actual annual earnings of Kroger workers in different levels of seniority. The bars in red going to the left are showing the shortfall from a living wage. And the axis on the right is showing different levels of seniority. So we've got all workers at the top with a number thousand shortfall. And then we have different levels of seniority. So even workers with 14 or more years of seniority who on average earn a little under $39,000 a year, they are close to $7,000 a year short of a living wage. And this shortfall increases all the way down the seniority ladder. For workers with less than 1 year of seniority, the average earnings are a little under $16,000, and the shortfall is close to $30,000 a year. Andrea, do you have your hand up? No? Somebody else does. Okay. So next slide, please. One of the consequences of not having enough money is not being able to buy enough food. So part of the survey that we conducted took questions from the United States Department of Agriculture's assessment tool for identifying who's food insecure. So we replicated that exact set of questions, and using this tool, 10.5% of all United States households are food insecure. The rate of food insecurity among Kroger workers is more than 7 times greater. 78% of Kroger employees are food insecure. This means things like, in the graph on the right, not being able to afford balanced and healthy meals, running out of food before the end of the month and not having enough money to buy more, cutting the size of meals or skipping meals because there's not enough money to get enough food, and sometimes even going hungry. Next slide, please. So one of the things we asked workers was, are they fairly compensated for their experience and the work they do? 73% of Kroger workers say they are not fairly compensated, that they are not paid adequately for their experience and for the work they do. Next slide, please. What we recommend in the report is a living wage for all workers, and a living wage benefits not just workers who are below the living wage level, it also benefits workers who are above the living wage level. The recommendations in the report call for a $623 million wage increase, payroll increase for workers below the living wage. And this in turn would produce a wage bump of over $127 million for workers who are already above the living wage level. This is because employers have to maintain a wage ladder. The workers who supervise other workers have to get paid more than the workers they supervise. There has to be an incentive for workers to accept promotions and take on more responsibility. So these wage increases that we are calling for and that are needed to enable Kroger workers to pay for the necessities of life have a bumping effect all the way up the wage ladder for Kroger workers. Next slide, please. We asked workers whether they earn enough to be able to pay for basic expenses every month, and 63% of Kroger employees say they are not able to make ends meet. They're not able to afford basic expenses every month. Next slide, please. So the two of the most basic expenses are groceries and rent. And what we're showing in this graph on this slide, in the red bars on the left side of the graph, we're showing the percent of workers in each age group, starting with 55 or older on the left, going up to workers in their 20s on the right, the share that aren't able to afford groceries every month. And in the blue bars to the right, on the right side of this graph, we're showing the share of workers who can't afford their rent every month. Again, starting with workers 55 and older and progressing to younger workers in the 20s. So among older workers, 55 or older, 24% cannot afford groceries every month, and 30% cannot afford rent every month. This is after having been employed for a long time, and these rates jump when you go to younger workers, to workers in their 20s. 49% cannot afford groceries and 53% cannot afford rent. Next slide, please. So we asked a series of questions about housing and people's housing security. 36% of Kroger workers are worried about being evicted. 18% did not pay last month's rent or mortgage on time. And 44% of Kroger workers live in housing that is overcrowded or inadequate. See, a large share of the Kroger workforce is precariously housed. Next slide, please. The consequence of precarious housing is homelessness, that when it's so uncertain whether you can pay rent in the next month, and maybe you missed rent last month, people wind up out on the street or in their car or couch surfing with a friend. More than 1 out of 7 Kroger employees is homeless tonight or has been homeless in the past year. This means that among the 37,000 folks we surveyed, over 5,000 have experienced homelessness or are homeless tonight. And I would like to say something else about this, that as Americans and as workers, we're taught to feel that it's our responsibility to pull up our bootstraps and make our way. But on the other hand, it takes a certain number of dollars to pay rent every month. And if you don't have those dollars, you're not able to pay rent. And it is not a failing of the individual if their employer does not pay them enough for them to keep a roof over their head. It is a defect of the employer. It is a failure of that employer's business model. So I would strongly urge that people who, for example, aren't able to buy enough groceries, or people who are truly precariously housed, that this is the basis for joining common bonds and recognizing this isn't a personal failing, this is a failing of the company, and this is something that does need to be changed. Next slide, please. This is showing the rates of homelessness among different groups of Kroger workers based on wage level, whether the worker is full-time or part-time, and levels of seniority. And what it's showing is that homelessness cuts across the entire labor force, higher wage workers as well as lower wage, full-time as well as part-time, long seniority as well as new hires. But it's far more prevalent among people who have less earnings, part-time jobs, and less seniority. Next slide, please. We asked in the survey whether workers would have enough money to support themselves after they retire based on the wages and benefits they receive from Kroger. 92% of workers say they will not be able to support themselves adequately when they retire. And this means that unless things change, there is no end in sight for the financial struggles that Kroger workers deal with. Next slide, please. We asked in the survey why workers quit their jobs at Kroger, and it's worth noting that the number of people leaving their job at Kroger has increased fourfold. It's 4 times greater since the COVID pandemic hit. And we asked folks responding to the survey to identify all of the reasons why people quit. 60% said a big reason is low wages. Another 60% say a big reason is excessive workload. 49% said the reason is schedules that change without notice or schedules that don't provide enough hours of work. Next slide, please. We asked workers whether people in their store are able to complete all of their assigned tasks and what the consequences were if they weren't able to. 56% of workers say that they are not able, and the other workers at the store are not able to complete all of the work that has to be done, and that this reduces the quality of food or services for customers. Another 18% said no work is not completed and that the safety and health of customers is jeopardized. So part of what is happening at Kroger that workers are testifying to is that as hours are cut and as the workforce shrinks, the quality of the brand and the quality of the services that stores deliver and the health and safety of workers and customers is declining. Next slide, please. We asked also about work schedules and the impacts on workers who are parents. 45% of Kroger employees get 3 days or less notice of what their schedule is going to be. 24% get 1 day or same day notice of what their schedule is going to be. This has a very severe impact on parents who have responsibilities both as workers for Kroger and as parents for their children. 68% of Kroger workers who get paid childcare, who arrange outside childcare for the kids, missed a shift last year because they could not find childcare. And across the board, whether workers are parents or not, 67% of all workers say that Kroger should help pay for childcare. Next slide, please. We also asked in the survey what people like about working at Kroger. What's the best thing about their job? And 67% of workers say their co-workers are the best thing about working at Kroger. A lesser number of folks said, well, the feeling of accomplishment from doing their work is a good thing. 31% said the customers are a good thing. 28% said doing essential work, but putting food on people's table is a good thing for them. But the biggest takeaway, I think, is that workers have strong bonds with each other. Workers have each other's backs on the job, and workers have truly positive feelings about their solidarity with each other. Next slide, please. We asked also in the survey about health and safety, particularly with regards to COVID and what workers experienced during COVID and how stores manage things during COVID. 68% of Kroger workers have confronted unfair risks and threats during COVID. Their safety has been compromised. This includes 55% of workers who had to deal with customers who refused to wear a mask. 49%, half of Kroger workers effectively, experienced verbal abuse from customers. 46% dealt with customers who wouldn't maintain social distance. 23%, almost a quarter, had threats of violence directed at them, and 22%, over a quarter, over a fifth, had violent incidents in their stores. And on a related question that's not on this slide, we asked how managers dealt with this, and predominantly managers ignored the situations and in some instances sided with the customers rather than backing the worker. So with this, I'd like to hand off to my colleague, Peter Dreyer, to discuss the rest of the slides.
Okay, next slide, please. So your members understand what we're talking about, and we asked, do you think that the company, Kroger, is heading in the right direction? And only 23% of the workers we surveyed said the company is heading in the right direction. And perhaps not surprisingly, those workers with the most seniority, the most experience at Kroger, have the most negative attitudes about working there and the least confidence in the company's direction. Next slide. We asked them whether they think the company cares about their safety and their health, and only 24% of Kroger workers think that the company really cares about the health and safety of employees and customers, and that the biggest priority for the company, from the very top to the managers at the store level, is sales, as opposed to the health and safety of either workers and the customers. Next slide. So Kroger can afford to do better. It's an incredibly prosperous corporation, and it's actually become more prosperous during the pandemic. It is the largest supermarket chain in the country. It's the 17th largest employer in the United States, with, in 2020, 132.5 billion in sales. Its operating profits have dramatically increased over the last year and a half. In 2020, the last reported profits, they made over $4 billion in operating profits. That's 35% more than the year before. And if you divide up the sales, 132.5 billion in sales, by the number of Kroger employees, which is about 465,000. Each employee basically contributes through their work an average of $285,000 a year in sales. So the employees are the ones that are making it possible for Kroger to have these big profits in sales. But none of them make anything close to 285,000 a year, which is what their per worker contribution really is. Next slide. Kroger's cash on hand, the amount of money they have available to do whatever they want with, has dramatically increased in the last 2 years. On February 1st, 2020, according to Kroger's own public documents, they had $400 million in cash on hand. In January last year, they had 1.68 billion in cash on hand. And just last November, the most recent, at the end of the third quarter, the most recent report from Kroger, they had $2.28 billion on cash on hand. So they could do whatever they want with that money. And as we'll see, they've chosen not to share their prosperity with their workers. Next. This is a little complicated, but it's a very important point, which is basically that over the last decade, while its sales have gone up 36%, adjusting for inflation, between 2010 and 2020, and the income has gone up by 102%, more than doubled, and the CEO pay has gone up from 7.5 million to over 22 million. It's an increase of 150%. Your members have seen, in inflation terms, a decline, 3% in Washington, 3% decline in real spending power in Colorado, and 5% in Orange and County and LA County in Southern California. So the gap is getting bigger. Kroger can afford to do better, and it chooses not to. Next slide. This is another way of saying the same thing, that Kroger's CEO has gotten huge pay increases. Rod McMullen, the CEO of the company based in Cincinnati, now makes over $22 million a year. Next slide. Here's Rod McMullen telling a worker how to do their job. That $22 million a year translates into, take a deep breath, $430,262 a week. That's over $10,000 an hour. The average Kroger worker makes $570 a week. Next slide. Another way of looking at this is that Rod McMullen in 2018 made 483 times what the median, the typical Kroger employee made. A year later, he was making 789 times what the typical Kroger employee made. And the most recent fact is from 2020. Again, he made 909, almost 1,000 times more than the typical Kroger employee. And we don't have a slide on this, but that 909 is bigger than by 3 times the average gap between CEOs and average workers, typical workers, for the 500 largest corporations in America, which is about 300 times the average worker. So Rod McMullen is doing much better compared to his employees than most CEOs of the largest corporations in America. Next slide. So all of you know that in 2020, Kroger gave its employees a few dollars extra a month of what they called hazard pay during the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic. But then they pulled the rug out from under the workers after 2 months and ended the hazard pay as the pandemic was getting worse in May of 2020. During that same period, Kroger gave its stockholders basically bonuses, which means they bought back their stock of 1.3 billion, which increased the value of each share of stock and was a bonanza for the stockholders in general, but particularly the biggest stockholders in the company. So that bar graph on the right, $342 million in hazard pay versus $1.3 billion in stock buybacks, tells you where the company's priorities are. Next slide. So as a result of this exhaustive study, Dan and I came up with some recommendations on different topics. And we're going to go through some of them very quickly now, and then we'll get to your questions and comments. So our first recommendation is that Kroger should increase the minimum wage for all its workers to $29 an hour. Some of them already make that, but very few do. And that would increase the average Kroger worker's annual income from roughly $29,600 a year to $45,760 a year, which is not living grandly. It's just enough for families to make ends meet. It's what is basically called a living wage. We think the company should double the share of workers who have full-time jobs. Right now, only about 30% of the frontline grocery workers for Kroger work full-time, and we think that should be at least 60%. We know that many of the workers that work part-time would like more hours a week. And we think Kroger should accommodate them. Because right now their strategy is low pay and part-time. We want it to be higher pay and full-time. We also think that Kroger should provide at least 1 week's notice of any schedule changes for part-time workers and provide overtime pay if this notice isn't given. Next slide. Right now, Kroger provides a 10% discount to its employees on Kroger branded food. That doesn't include, for example, fresh produce. That's mostly canned goods that have Kroger's name on it. We think that they should provide a 50% discount on all groceries and not just Kroger food, but whatever's in the store. It's really outrageous, as we talked about earlier, that people spend all day working with food and then they go home and 78% of them are food insecure. So Kroger can deal with that directly by both raising wages and providing a bigger discount on its groceries for the people that work at its stores. Kroger should provide immediate housing assistance for employees who are experiencing homelessness or face the threat of eviction. And we think that Kroger should provide childcare subsidies for employees who have children younger than 12 years of age. Next slide. And finally, we think that Kroger should give workers, and workers should demand a stronger voice in how the company operates. The report has a long section on the 11 members of the board of directors who are all people with big connections in the corporate elite of America. We think there's nobody on the board of directors right now who represents either consumers or workers. We think that Kroger should add 2 positions to its board of directors for its unionized employees, and that those members of the board of directors should be elected by fellow workers. And finally, we think that Kroger should work with the UFCW to create worker representation committees in every region of the country where members are selected by the unions. What would these committees do? They would issue annual reports, sort of like this, on the state of Kroger workers and present them to the board of directors at the annual shareholder meetings and basically expose the conditions of the living and working conditions of the workers so that the board of directors and the public have a chance to understand what it's like to be a frontline worker for Kroger and how the company, which is making huge profits and has been made prosperous by its workers, can do better by sharing that prosperity with the people who make the company so profitable. That's our recommendations. That's the end of our summary. We'd like to thank everybody who participated in helping us do this survey. And now we're open to your comments and questions, which will be handled by Kathy Finn.
Yeah, so there are some really great questions. The first one I think is really super important, which is about how do people get access to this information? And maybe you can talk about how this is going to be made public and how people have access to that information.
We skipped through the last slide pretty quickly.
Oh,
The
sorry.
report is going to be available on the Economic Roundtable website at midnight tonight, and everybody can download it for free. Just do a Google search on Economic Roundtable, and also there was a URL in that last slide.
Can you put the website in the chat so people can know where to go? And then everyone who wants to can download it. Maybe somebody can put the Economic Roundtable website information in the chat. And then the next question.
Kathy, let me add one more thing, which is a lot of newspaper reporters have requested copies of the report. And so by tomorrow, there should be stories in a number of papers in the different parts of the country, in the Seattle, Colorado, and Southern California areas, and maybe, beyond that in national magazines and newspapers. So the world will hopefully hear more about this report sometime tomorrow.
Thanks, Dan and Peter. So the next question is pretty interesting about, Dan mentioned the failure of the Kroger business model. And the question is, has anyone created a different type of business model with more altruistic goals? It seems that companies would be able to find management and executives who would be willing to get paid more closely aligned with their frontline grocery workers. And if not, maybe they are in the wrong line of business. So are you aware of any companies that do have a more maybe altruistic model?
Well, I think if you roll back the clock, you see it at many of the brands that Kroger bought up. So a lot of Kroger's growth has occurred through buying smaller family chains of grocery stores and then cutting wages in those stores. And so I probably know less about this than you, Kathy, and John, and other UFCW leaders here, Andrea. But my understanding is that Fred Meyer's and King Soopers and Ralph's were all smaller chains bought up by Kroger. And we in the survey got a lot of comments from people saying, how things have deteriorated since Kroger took over the brand. There are also business models like food co-ops. In the report, we discuss the idea of filling the vacuum in areas where the big grocery chains won't open stores by public support for co-ops and for living wages for workers who work in those co-ops. And in the survey, workers made comments, for example, about Costco and Trader Joe having a better wage structure than Kroger. So there are models for treating workers better than Kroger does.
And if you look at, if you compare the United States with some other countries like Germany or Sweden or England or France, the gap between what the top executives make and what the average workers make is much more narrow. So it's, you know, it's possible to have a private sector economy and big corporations where the companies operate in a more humane and pro-worker way. And the United States has some companies like that, but Kroger isn't one of them.
Thank you. So there's a question in the chat about the strategy for you know, the companies, whether they're negotiating together or separately, and what's the strategy in the event that the companies you know, have maybe a mutual aid pact or whatever. And I think that's more of a question potentially for the presidents of the locals. But so I think we could get back to that one. I'm going to give them a minute to think about that. And while they're thinking about that, maybe we can answer the next question, which is more about the report, which is, what is the estimated cost of implementing your recommendations?
The cost was in one of the slides, and as I recall, it was 627 million for workers who were under 623 million for workers who are below the living wage, and then that would have a kind of secondary bumping effect for other workers to maintain the wage ladder. But to bring workers up to a living wage in the regions we surveyed is $623 million. And Kathy, could I gratuitously throw in something about your pending question? And that is simply that our recommendations also include legislative action by cities, counties, states. And so that these problems of inequality and inadequate pay, we recommend be addressed through public action as well. So thanks for letting me slip that in.
Oh, absolutely. Does any one of the presidents want to talk a little bit about strategy?
I mean, I think right now the local presidents met today, and I think we're still meeting in terms of sort of assessing exactly how we're going to approach it. We haven't yet even received dates from Kroger or Albervons. And I think depending on their configuration is our configuration. But I think you can see with leading this report, we've sort of taken Kroger and tried to use this to, in fact, pose it as opposed to the support that's received in the community for all the grocery workers. I think the two polls, I think, will allow us to go forward.
I would also just add that, first of all, it's maybe a slightly different strategy for Washington State and Southern California and Colorado, which is on the verge of a strike this week. But we've seen around the country, for example, Oregon ended up striking Kroger, and Albertsons, Safeway reaped the benefits of those stores being closed down by the UFCW. So I think we can look around the country and feel pretty sure that these two companies aren't necessarily going to depend on one another to get the best contract. If one of them is ready, or if one of them wants to put up the fight, they're not necessarily tied to one another in that sense. But as John said, strategy will be developed as we move along.
Thanks. And there's a question, sort of interesting. Why doesn't Kroger invest in more reusable energy or updated stores if they're making so much profit, knowing that such a thing would increase their sales? I think that's maybe a little bit outside of what you guys were studying, but I don't know if you want to opine about why they don't invest in more reusable energy.
Well, we didn't study that, but I think sustainability is a mindset, and that it's cross-cutting, that there's environmental sustainability and there's social sustainability, and they do tend to go together. That for a community to be truly sustainable, it has to be it has to give people the minimum requisites for living, and also it has to have an environment where we can breathe the air and not have environmental catastrophe. And so Kroger should be moving forward on all of these fronts.
And then a good question here about the sample size from the survey. So somebody's commenting that seems small, that only 10,000 out of 37,000 responded to the survey. Would this be something that Kroger might argue once it's released and going into negotiations?
I'm sure Kroger will have something to say about that, but it's a very good sample size. I mean, the surveys that predict with reasonable accuracy the outcomes of elections in the United States, the presidential elections, will have something 1,700, 1,700 or less survey respondents. So a response pool of over 10,000 people, a response rate of 28% to an internet survey, responses from every single store. And the surveys are carefully weighted the same way you do with election surveys, for example, that any professional survey organization does, are weighted to represent the membership of the locals. So it's a scientific survey. It's a large sample. It's a very strong response rate. And it is, in fact, the voice of Kroger workers. And if Kroger has any criticisms about it, we'd love to see their survey data. We'd love to see their data about how many of their workers are homeless or food insecure. What we've heard anecdotally in our focus groups is that Kroger carries out surveys and the store managers cherry pick the respondents and sit with them while they respond to the surveys. So this is anecdotal, but we would love to see Kroger's survey data about these issues.
And one other thing that we didn't mention is that at the end of the survey, the questions, we gave people a chance to, in an open-ended part of the survey, to just tell us whatever information about their working and living conditions they wanted to. And a huge percentage of those folks responded and had lots of fascinating things to say, which we incorporated into the survey report. And that gave us even a sort of a different perspective, or confirmed a lot of the findings of the survey itself. Kroger is going to say what Disney said after we did a similar report of Disneyland workers, that the survey is biased because it was done on behalf and with a union. But that doesn't tell us whether it was scientific or anything. So, when Disney tried to do that, nobody took that seriously because they never were able to challenge the actual findings of the survey. And what Dan was just saying is that Kroger will not be able to challenge. I mean, they can say it, but they don't have any alternative information about things like food insecurity and homelessness and the number of people that can't pay their rent and stuff like that. So the proof is in whether or not the workers' voice came out clearly, and we think it did. And Kroger's not going to be able to challenge or have any really counter evidence for that.
I'd add to what you just said, Peter, that the human face and the human voice of workers also validates in a very compelling way what the report says. And we've already been having newspaper reporters wanting to speak to workers. They have been speaking with workers. And the honest, straightforward face of an intelligent, hardworking person who's dealing with these problems and works for Kroger's is evidence that backs up the outpouring in the survey, particularly these open-ended comments that Peter mentioned.
Thanks. There's a question in the Q&A that's in Spanish, and I don't want to do a mangled translation, so I don't know if Julia or Ernesto can maybe read that and translate it. And while you're looking at that, I will go to the next question, which is that we know that right to work states have more extreme levels of poverty and lower wages. Do we know, or can you estimate how much worse the conditions are in right to work states?
Well, Colorado has a lower wage floor than many counties in Washington and the state of California. And there we did see evidence of more extreme hardship and more extreme conditions on workers in Colorado and that are earning below the wages in the range of $13 an hour, $14 an hour. So Colorado is the main example, and I think some of the rural counties of Washington and areas that we surveyed. But it is as expensive to live in most areas of Colorado as it is to live in Los Angeles or Seattle. And so these poverty level wages truly create extreme hardship, particularly in Colorado.
I mean, another way to say that is that the conditions that we were able to identify by asking UFCW members to respond to the survey are conditions in a company that's unionized. And so the union has actually made things a lot better than they would otherwise have been. And so if you went to a Kroger store in a that isn't unionized, or any grocery store that isn't unionized, in a right to work state or in any other state, particularly in a right to work state, the things we described in this report would be even worse. So, unions create some protections from the worst kind of management practices, but things could be done better by Kroger. And the companies that operate in non-union, that are non-union, have much worse conditions.
And then the next question I think is really, really, really crucial and is to not just to you guys, but I think to all the presidents. It says it would be beneficial for this information to be passed on to workers in an easily digestible way, like flyers or pamphlets. Is that something the local leadership can do? And I mean, I personally am going to say, I think that's an excellent idea. And I think we need to figure out how to do that. But I don't know if anybody else wants to.
I agree. I think we want to get that out to our members.
Yeah, thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons, for doing the study is to gather this information and then disseminate it. So that's the next step, obviously, is to figure out the best way to disseminate it. And then there are two people asking a similar question, which is that, are you suggesting, this one's to Dan and Peter, are you suggesting that really everyone, that we should get rid of all of our pay scales and that everyone should be making the same hourly amount regardless of seniority or classification? Is that what you're suggesting? Two different folks are sort of asking that.
No, we're suggesting a minimum floor of $29 an hour. And that more seniority, more experience can go beyond that, obviously. But no one should make less than a living wage.
Yeah, the principle that Peter and I are putting forward is simply people need to be able to live. They need to be able to pay rent and buy groceries. And so sometimes the term that I use is a wage floor, and you raise the wage floor, but then you have wage progression above that floor, as Peter says, for workers with more seniority, who are supervisors, have more responsibility. So it's not everybody earning the same wage, but it's raising the bottom rung so that people can live.
And then somebody comments that many grocery workers rely on state and federal assistance for food and housing, and that, because Kroger doesn't provide a livable wage, they're pushing the burden onto government. And does your survey address that issue in any way?
The report includes an analysis of how many workers get food stamps and how many workers get cash assistance, and raising the wage floor reduces people's reliance on the social safety net and on taxpayers. So that through charitable organizations, nonprofits such as food banks, as well as food stamps, as well as welfare assistance, the public is making up for wages that Kroger doesn't pay, and raising the wage floor would reduce that drain on taxpayer dollars. I'm sorry, Peter, I cut you off.
That's all right. There's a section in the report, which is a profile of the corporation. And it includes a section called corporate welfare. It talks about how Kroger as a company has gotten lots of tax breaks from state and local governments and other forms of government assistance. For example, a month ago, the state of North Carolina gave Kroger, I think it was $7 million to open up one of its new warehouses in the form of subsidies. And if I were the governor or a legislator in North Carolina, I would say, we're only going to make this subsidy available to you on the condition that you guarantee living wages for the people that work in the warehouse. But the North Carolina politicians didn't do that. But so there is a section that not only about the percentage of Kroger workers in the survey that are have to rely on food stamps or food banks or Medicaid, but also how the company itself is a recipient of government welfare.
So I got the translation of the Spanish language question. So this isn't specifically about the report though, which we're going to try to stay focused on the report, but it does say, due to the excessive COVID infections, the test results are coming back quite delayed, and some of us have been working while infected. Is there something we can do about that? And that Kroger, and then a comment with the question is that Kroger should be providing testing for workers so that they don't get such, delayed results, forcing people to work infected. So that's not specifically about the report, but I don't know if one of the presidents wants to respond to that one quickly.
I guess I would just say that this is a very, very serious problem that we have been trying to address, not only with the corporations, but with the various state governments. But we've been able to, in the past, put some pressure on in California, but that has lapsed. So we do still have a lot of work to do to make sure that our members who do test positive have an opportunity to be able to stay home and still pay their bills. And the UFCW in California, and I'm assuming it's elsewhere as well, is working very diligently to get this done as quickly as possible.
Yeah, it's a moving target. We at 367, we negotiated LOUs on COVID and testing and all that. And all of those LOUs have now expired. But my understanding is that Kroger is still paying people when they test positive. The problem is it takes forever to get the money. It can be weeks and weeks and lots of red tape for them to get paid. So it's not really working. And then Inslee was going to pass a mandatory vaccine mandate, and originally without any testing option, but our membership's pretty divided on that issue. So we went to Inslee's office and campaigned that there should be a testing option. Now it's all sort of been set aside until the Biden thing is figured out in the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So the next question is there a way that we can expose Rodney McMullen for the greedy CEO that he is? I mean, I suppose that's the whole point of this, which is going to be released tomorrow.
There's a long section in the report as part of the Kroger corporate profile on the top 5 executives and the members of the board of directors. It tells you how much they make and how big their homes are and all the other boards they're on and all the other ties they have with the corporate establishment and all the different institutions they're on the boards of. They're part of a small group of people that are often called the power structure, the power elite. And so, yeah, there's a lot of information on Rod McMullen and the other both board members and top executives in the report if you go to that section of the report.
I would add to that I think the information in the report shows that the Kroger Corporation is being hollowed out by its employment practices, that when you don't staff stores adequately, there are health and safety issues, there's a reduction in customer service. And I would say this is a red flag to investors. Most of Kroger's stock is owned by institutional investors, and that it's worth considering the security of that investment given the labor practices of Kroger.
And then there's sort of related questions here. One person is saying, is the $29 minimum wage really a possibility that Kroger would ever agree to? Or are we just getting people's hopes up? And I'm just going to say this other question, you can sort of answer them together, which is that what do you recommend I as a steward do with this information to help us get the results that we're looking for? So it's kind of flip side of the question. Can we really do it? And what should we do to move that along? And I think that may be a question for the presidents as well as maybe Dan and Peter.
I'd say two things. One is in terms of what shop stewards and your staff can do with the report. I mean, part of the reason the report, I think, resonates is because, as Dan said, a lot of people think that, they may be the only people facing this problem. They're living in their car, or they go home and they have to, they can only give their kids ramen and noodles and hot dogs. They think I did something wrong. And this basically shows that this is a systemic problem of the corporation and its practices. And it basically exposes that. And I think whatever facts you want to use to come out of the report, it's a way of saying to the members of the union, you're not alone. This is a collective problem that's caused by Kroger. And about the $29 an hour, you don't get anything unless you demand it. That's the history of the labor movement. Right?
I would add to what your excellent comment, Peter, that the start of solving a problem is to see it clearly. And the reality is we all need to eat, we all need a roof over our head, and it costs a certain amount to do that, and that the amount is about $29 an hour. So I think the starting point is to recognize what's fair. And I think it's also to recognize that Kroger's business model is defective, that we can't assume that the future should always look like the present or the past, because it's a defective business model that extracts wealth from workers and gives it disproportionately to shareholders and upper management, and that model needs to change. And there is money in that model to treat workers much more fairly and much more sustainably than they are treated today.
Kathy, there's a question in the chat. Will Kroger close stores if they have to pay $29 an hour?
Yeah, there's a couple of people asking about whether Kroger can afford it. So
and part of the reason we did the analysis of all their cash on hand and their growing profits and the exorbitant pay they pay their executives is to point out that yes, they can afford it. Throughout the last century, whenever somebody has proposed a good idea, a minimum wage, OSHA for workplace safety, environmental laws, paid family leave, whatever, every corporation in America, the Chamber of Commerce, they all do the same thing. They cry wolf. The boy who cried wolf. They say we can't afford it and this will destroy the economy. And they're always wrong. They're always wrong. They're always bluffing. They're trying to do it to scare people. And so I'm sure that that's what Kroger will say. We can't afford it and we'll have to shut down the stores and you'll all be out of work. But they're making so much money right now that they can afford to do it. If they want to if they try to close 1 or 2 stores, as they did during the pandemic in the early days to try to scare people from passing hazard pay, then they'll do it. But if you remember, a lot of cities, including Seattle and LA, passed hazard pay, and Kroger's still doing fine.
John?
Yeah. So 3 things. One is, I think what this report shows is that there is a shark in the water, and that this shark has been coming and has been not just nibbling, but taking bites out of the workforce over and over and over again. And what this tonight is about us to take a line from Jaws about building a bigger boat in order to fend ourselves and protect ourselves from the shark. And that's why we're 3 states, all these locals. This report is to, in fact, arm ourselves with information. And we're fortunate in a way that others in this country aren't, and that we're able to have a conversation. The fact that we have a contract means that they're obligated by law to sit down and talk with us. And as Peter's Latin will tell us, a conversation is turning somebody with you. And this is our opportunity to turn Kroger around with us in a way to make this, to bring this back, and this is the 3rd point, to what it was 30, 40 years ago, that people in fact could live off. This was a career job, that it's not an untenable idea that in fact you could be a grocery worker and have a livable wage and have a place to stay and in fact send your kids to college and in fact be able to enjoy the riches of your community. That's what the report is about, is beginning the conversation with not just Kroger, but with elected officials and our communities as well, so that we hold Kroger responsible. We give Kroger a charter to do business in our communities, and that charter demands that they in fact take into account what's in the best interest of the community. And that's what this report's about, and that's what we have to do. Each of the stewards, each of those of you tonight who've given up your night, and we know how difficult that is, to in fact participate and become active by listening and then turning this into a mobilization and building leadership that in fact we can get that contract that we need.
Let's see, there's not too many questions left related to the report. There is one here about our in-store experience suggests COVID infection rates are higher amongst grocery store workers. Does information in the survey back that up? I'm not sure the survey does, but I can say that we definitely know that the infection rates are higher amongst our membership than the general public. And I don't know if the survey speaks to that at all.
Well, the survey asked workers if they'd been infected, and 20% said that they had been infected. Some said that the infection had and unfortunately been transmitted from them to vulnerable family members at home. It's a little as a little bit of an apples and oranges element to comparing the survey responses to national data, but the Center for Disease Control shows about a 12% infection rate based on tests of the public. So the survey responses suggest a higher COVID infection rate among grocery workers, and not at all surprising given that grocery workers are face to face with the public, masked and unmasked, day in, day out.
And then there's one other good question here, and I think that your report did talk about this, I think, which is that as more and more people make a living wage, they then spend money and it sort of helps out the whole economy. Did your report address that a bit?
We have a chapter on the multiplier effects from paying a living wage. And so there's kind of two dimensions to it. Right now, we go into grocery stores, myself, for example, as a customer, and I buy groceries. Those profits go to Cincinnati, they go to shareholders in New York and all over the world. Those profits, a lot of what I pay if I go into a Kroger store and buy groceries doesn't stay in my community. If we raise wages of people who work in stores, a bigger share of the money that gets paid at cash registers stays in our communities, and it has multiplier effects. People in turn go out and buy more groceries themselves. They get better housing. They go to restaurants. They see their doctor. They go to movie theaters. They buy a better car or get the car fixed. So that money that Kroger workers get through a pay increase enriches their community and enriches all of the businesses in their community. It also enriches the tax base. There's more taxes paid to local government, and our local government is better funded.
Another way of saying that is that a $29 minimum wage for Kroger workers is good for the economy.
Somebody asked how many stewards are actually on this call, because I don't think the attendees can see the number. So there are definitely over 200 that have been on pretty much the entire time. I think reached a high of close to 230 or 240 attendees on the call, which is a good number of folks to get activated to fight for this. And then somebody asked if 29 is the minimum, what should we be thinking of as a potential top wage? And I just want to say on that one, and any other presidents could speak to this, is I mean, there was a question about raising expectations too high and people being disappointed. And I don't know if like 100% of everything's going to be achieved in one contract, but we at least know the direction that we're going. But I don't know if anybody else wants to address, if 29 is the minimum, where are we going in terms of the top wage? Anybody have an opinion on that? I mean, I guess, the only answer I could give to that is we don't, not all of this, I think, is going to be achieved in one contract, but this is definitely the time with COVID to be raising expectations and making sure that folks are getting, an adequate contract. Whether it's all going to be achieved in one fell swoop, I'm not sure.
But
Yeah,
talking about a top wage, I would say that if there were Kroger workers on the board of the company, they could have a top wage for its corporate executives. So, maybe that the nobody in the company would be able to make more than, I'll make up a number, 200 times what the average Kroger worker makes, which would be another incentive to raise the wages for the average Kroger worker, like they do in a lot of other countries. And Mark, let me just say two other things quickly. There was one suggestion that the union send the report to the big stockholders, the big institutional investors of Kroger. That seems to me a good idea. And then somebody else suggested putting it on the website of all the locals, the report, to give people access. So, that's up to you guys.
Kathy, I think to the question about achieving the $29 minimum wage, or what the wage would be for the journey, if that were to happen in this report, it's really about establishing a North Star goal and fighting tooth and nail to get as close as we can or beyond, depending on how much power we can collectively organize amongst our various locals, and working together and using this as a starting point to continue to just build power. And if we can get beyond that, great, but we're just going to build as much power and leverage over the companies as we can and get as much money as we possibly can with that power. And take it contract by contract and continue to fight for what we consider, the gold standard of a grocery contract.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. There's another question about whether health and welfare was addressed in the survey. And, Kroger across the country has been making proposals to get out of strong union bargained health insurance plan and going into its own inferior Kroger plan, and whether that was addressed at all in the survey.
We did not do an analysis of the benefits part of Kroger employment. The health benefits were mentioned by a number of people in the survey as one of the most valued things of their employment with Kroger. So preserving and protecting a strong benefits package is important, particularly healthcare. It's something that a lot of workers care about.
And then there's a question about how would we get a union member on the board of directors?
You want to answer that, Peter?
Well, there's a number of ways. I mean, some politicians in the Senate have actually proposed legislation requiring corporations that are regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission to have employees on the board. General Motors had members of the United Auto Workers on its board, and they bargained for it basically as a condition of their contract.
And then there's a question about, and this this may be outside of Southern California too, but a question about closing the gap between the service deli bakery or the GM classifications and the food clerks. And I think was already mentioned, we had a meeting today amongst all the presidents, at least in Southern California, and that's definitely a very big issue in these negotiations. So that definitely is going to be addressed. And again, I mean, as Sean said, it comes down to the power that we can get by working together to push the company to make that happen. Let's see. Trying to see if there's anything still unanswered. I think we've just about answered or addressed everything. There's still, I just want to reiterate maybe as the last thing, because still a bunch of people are asking, how do we get the report? Where's the report going to be shared? Can we put it up on our bulletin boards? Can we put it up? So can you just kind of talk again about how the report is going to be disseminated starting tonight and tomorrow?
Sure. So the report is now a public domain document. Anybody can have it. Anybody can distribute it. We have a news embargo that ends at midnight tonight. We reached out to a lot of reporters and offered them an embargoed copy of the report so they'd have a chance to read it. And that embargo ends at midnight, and so that then it goes public tomorrow. It'll be available on our website, and anybody else who wants to put it on their website is welcome to do that. Kathy, there was a question that popped up a second ago about whether we separated union members from non-union members in the survey. Could I speak to that just real quickly?
Absolutely.
So the locals that participated in the survey provided the employment IDs, the employee IDs of their members, and we validated survey responses against those IDs. We asked people in the survey for their employee ID. So this survey is purely of frontline workers. It's of union members. It's not of non-union members. Thanks for letting me slip that in.
Absolutely. And so I may have, I mean, I've been trying to look at all the questions coming in the Q&A as well as all the ones coming in the chat. It's not super easy.
So
So if I missed something, I'm sorry, but I think we've pretty much addressed. There were, a few questions that came in about what to do about certain things that could sort of unrelated. There was one other question about the direction we can go in regards to the pension. And there are multiple locals and multiple different contracts being addressed on this call. I know at least, and so I know there's different things happening with the pension up in Washington than in Southern California. And I'm not sure what's happening in Colorado. I can just say for Southern California, our pension is in what's called the red zone. So as of right now, we cannot do pension improvements, but we are getting additional money in. The pension is improving. And we talked today in our meeting about how we can, some avenues we can take to change that situation and be able to make pension improvements. And I don't know if this person's question was from Southern California or elsewhere. So I don't know if somebody from any of the other regions wants to talk about their pension issues, but
I think before Andrea speaks, someone talked about what we can do about it. Those of you who've been moved by this and strikes a chord, it's critical that you speak to this, that the power of this report comes through the membership, those who are doing the work. And reporters, this is the time for people to step forward and say, this is my life. This is how Kroger has impacted my family. And we need those of you on the call and those that to be able to stand up and come forward. So I would contact your rep or your union and say that you're available to speak to this report and want to speak to this report. This is how we make this report animated, how we make it alive. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of sheets of paper that's going to stay on a desk and it has no value then. It's a burden rather than a benefit. We have to make this a benefit for our contractual negotiations.
Sorry, just to add to that really quickly, we're recording this webinar, and the recording of the webinar as well as the report itself will be made into links and be on our website, and I assume the websites of the other locals who want it. So if somebody missed the webinar, you can certainly direct them and they can watch the recording. And then Andrea, did you have a comment?
So no, I was just gonna, just to wrap up, I again want to, first of all, thank Peter and Dan for not only your presentation, but for this very, very thorough evidence-based research that you conducted, very scientific, and it reflects, I know, the sentiment of all of us on this call. Our members live this every single day. This from a personal point of view is probably nothing that they don't think for themselves, but to see it presented this way really, gives it a lot of power. And as John said, we can use this power. We're going into negotiations, and Kroger is not going to give us anything. We're going to take what we deserve. And by having this evidence-based information, we can use this to start making sure that all of our members, all of your coworkers, realize that you really do have a lot of power, and that this is your time. This is our time to get what we really believe our members deserve and have worked for so many years, especially during the last couple of years of the pandemic. So thank you all for being on this call, and thank you most of all for what you do every single day. This is the start of, I think, a movement that will benefit workers throughout the UFCW, whether it's on the West Coast or anywhere else, to start really demonstrating to the public that these corporations need to need to step up and do the right thing for both the workers and the communities. So again, thank you very much. And we all will be disseminating the report through our websites, through links, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Right.